Hello, I'd like to welcome you to the Life Space Crisis. These are interventions for educators. And I wanted to do this so that you would understand another intervention to use when you're dealing with adolescents. If we had had a seminar on this, and I did schedule one, but it was right before Christmas, I wanted you to take a field trip to Life Space Crisis Intervention, their website. And on this website, they teach staff working with students therapeutic talking strategies to help students during stressful moments. They also teach awareness and skills to understand and manage your own feelings so that you don't get into a power struggle when students are having difficulties. If you go to that website, I'd like you to click on the angry smile and some of the research studies. I know we know about acting out behavior, but I'm not sure you understand acting in behavior. So I'd like for you to think about how we identify aggressive behavior. However, some of the aggressive behavior that we see is passive-aggressive behavior. And I'd like you to think about how you've observed passive-aggressive behavior and whether or not you've demonstrated this behavior. So we could discuss some examples, but this isn't a seminar. But I'd like for you to think about your own children or children that you've seen when you've asked them to do something and they don't do it or they take a long time doing it. This is passive-aggressive behavior. So sometimes when students are not turning in assignments or not listening, this is really what we would call passive-aggressive behavior. But I think you can probably think of other behaviors that we would describe as passive-aggressive. We know what aggressive behavior is, but do we know what passive-aggressive behavior? When we look at youth in crisis, it's very important, and we've talked about this in our classes. It's important that they are valued and treated with respect. We want to have them learn to trust caring adults, and of course that would be used in the classroom. And we'd also like for you to be someone that could support them in times of crisis. We also want them to become aware of their patterns for self-defeating behavior, because sometimes students get into a pattern and actually they're shooting themselves in the foot. And we want them to acquire social skills that they can use in the classroom and as they go forward. We also want them to learn to accept responsibility for inappropriate actions. So Life Skills Crisis Intervention provides specific strategies for children and for teachers. We want to, some things that children do is they will escalate incidents into a no-win power struggle. And teachers do this sometimes, just by how they deal with the student. Some students just distort reality. They're just not aware of what's really going on. And they misperceive cues, they misinterpret things, and this results in some problems in the classroom. Some of these students are self-abusive. Some of them have destructive peer relationships. We know they lack social skills. And some of them have very little conscience for aggressive behavior. And of course, I'm very concerned about those students because when we see students that don't have empathy, don't understand how someone else may feel, and don't really care how other people feel, then we have a dangerous situation in the classroom. And unless we address it, we will have the potential for having an incident where someone gets hurt. And of course, in the long term, we want students to be able to go on and not have some of these behaviors. We want them to develop a conscience, to understand how other people feel. Because we know what happens when we have people that don't have a conscience. We call these people sociopaths. So one of the articles that I wanted you to read are in the Kaplan Library. There's an article on by Forthan, Payne, and McCombie on life skills crisis intervention in a school setting. And the second article is by Forbringer and Johan Peter, and this was an article on the shattered mask, a red flag carry-in interview. I'll tell you more about these. So, one thing that we know about situations in the classroom, there's misbehavior, that's non-physical. Then there's misbehavior that's physical. I think we can understand those two differences. Sometimes there are academic issues that children are dealing with, their family issues, their relationship issues, personal issues, and teacher-student issues. So from reading those two articles, you will learn a little bit about the differences in these issues. Now, in the red flag carry-on, and I have this baton being passed, I want you to picture a student has a crisis, and they come to the school and they come into your classroom, let's say that, and they're volatile, they're upset, and you know that there is a problem. And in the red flag carry-on, what they're talking about, the red flag is that someone has brought a problem into the classroom. It has nothing to do with you, but the problem is there, and so you have to deal with it. And in the red flag carry-on, the first stage is the drain-off. And in the drain-off, this is a de-escalation where you will talk to the student, you sit them down. What I usually do is I just listen. I'll say, tell me what happened. I don't say what someone else told me. I don't say what I saw. I want to hear in their own words. I want them to tell me what happened exactly. So what you're doing is you're de-escalating and you're draining off the student's feelings. And you're trying to control any counter-aggressive reactions that you might have, actually. In this drain-off, you also want to know what is the issue. You know, what is their perception of the crisis? You want to know if what does the crisis, if as you're looking at the timeline, you want to know, does the crisis represent one of the patterns of self-defeating behavior that you'll read about in those articles? But you really want to identify the issue. And their perception of the issue is very important. I think I've discussed this in one of our discussions, that it's important to listen, and even if they're off base, what they tell you is important because perceptions are their reality, actually. The next step is insight, and you want to know, and in this step, you're going to address their pattern of self-defeating behavior. And you may talk about them about, now you know the last time this happened, this is what you did. How is this working for you? And you start talking to them so they can get some insight into how they're reacting and whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, whether it's working out for them or just getting them in more trouble. In the next stage, that's new skills, where you could teach the student, you could give them some suggestions of things they could do. Now, when this happens, do you think you could do this or do that? And you discuss that with the student. It doesn't have to be very long. You're just immediately trying to give them some different options. And what you want to do in the process is teach them some interpersonal skills so that they can overcome this behavior. Now, in the last stage, the transfer of learning, is where you will help the student generalize these skills and behavior. And you could say, do you think you could use this, what we've just talked about, this new skill, could you use it in another situation? What could you do? Do you think it might help you when you run into someone else who does this to you? So it's a conversation that you're having. And they call this the red flag carry because the student has come to you. The problem is not with you. The problem is not in the classroom. Something has happened, and sometimes it does happen in the classroom, but it's happened, and you need to deal with it and work on some training and some new skills. So, what did you learn? You're going to listen to the student to get their perception of the problem and to drain off intense feelings. You're going to control your impulse to power struggle, because if you get into a confrontation and a power struggle with students, usually you will escalate the problems. You want to validate the perceptions of the student. You want to determine what's the central issue. What is really the issue? Sometimes the presenting problem is not the real issue. And you want to know what is the pattern of behavior. When this happens, how do you usually react? How does this work? You're going to ask, can you help the student with some insights so they see what's working, what isn't working, how they're being perceived, how they may be misinterpreting things, and can you teach new skills? So I think in this seminar we talked about the final project. I think you understand the final project, And of course that's due today, so I'm not going to go through the final project. I'll just advance through here. You know, that final project, of course, builds upon that case study that you did in Unit 4. And I think all those things are pretty self-explanatory. So I'd like to thank you, and I hope this helps you understand this life skills crisis intervention.